Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and in this video I want to talk about the problem of evil. Now, I'm sure all of the Christians that may or may not end up watching this video are immediately going to groan aloud and roll their eyes, because, of course, the problem of evil has been widely overdone by atheists, and, worse, especially from the Christian perspective, has more than one apologetic that can be used to respond to it, which neutralize it from a Christian perspective. Or at least so most Christians and most atheists believe. However, I don't think it's actually that simple. I think that the apologetics that Christians give, at least the ones that I'm aware of, for the problem of evil, are generally quite unsatisfactory and don't really do the job that they purport to do. But before I really get into it, let me outline once more, just in case you're not aware, what the problem of evil is. So, the first premise of the problem of evil is, if we're doing this in a proof by contradiction manner, is there is a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. The second premise is a God who is omniscient will be aware of all evil. The third premise is a God who is omnipotent will be capable of stopping all evil. And the fourth premise is that a God who is omnipotent will be capable of stopping all evil. And so the conclusion is essentially an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God would be aware of, desirous of, and capable of eliminating evil. So if there is, so that's the sub-conclusion. Then the next point is point 6, there is evil. So then point 7, therefore, if there is a God, it cannot have one of these properties. Now, before I delve into defending this argument, I want to explain why this argument is actually interesting and important for an atheist and a theist and the discussion between them. And I think the reason is twofold. First, if one of these properties is eliminated, then ontological arguments suddenly become far less convincing, because most of them are based on the concept that whatever God exists must have all three of these properties because it's maximally good and perfect. And so if you can prove that, given the material facts of our reality, a God which possesses perfect perfection in all of these ways is impossible, suddenly the ontological argument loses its force, because the perfect concept that it's trying to push for is suddenly incapable of existing. Furthermore, the second reason that this argument is important is because the Christian God, as described in the Bible, is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. God is everywhere and knows everything. All things are possible through God. And finally, God is love, and a number of other statements, particularly in the Gospel of John, I believe, to that effect. So, if the problem of evil actually works, it first of all neutralizes all possible ontological arguments. It second of all makes the Christian God essentially impossible unless you want to cherry pick different gospels, at which point you're constructing an alternate version of Christianity, which is no more likely to be true than any other constructed religion. And then furthermore, on a third and slightly less strong point, it also makes the moral argument far less convincing. Because if you remove omniscience from God, then it becomes doubtful whether that God can actually know totally what is good for us if he's not aware of all evils. And, to the huge extent that we see evil today would mean that the God is actually quite myopic when it comes to evils, and therefore might not be a very good moral authority. If you remove omnipotence, then and the extent to which we see evil in our world means that this God, which is not omnipotent, is not particularly powerful either, and so that raises questions about whether that God can actually send us to heaven or hell, and whether it actually created us and so on. And if it's not omnibenevolent, then that robs whatever moral authority you might think like this God has to dictate what we do. So, in essence, in conclusion, if the problem of evil works as an argument, then it's a actually quite serious problem for Christianity. Now, again, even if the problem of evil works, a Christian could simply bite the bullet and say, yes, well, perhaps my God isn't omnibenevolent. But then again, this returns both to the problem of a constructed religion and also, raises the question of whether this God is worthy of worship, and so on. Okay, so let me go into defending the problem of evil. The first and most common response, but the one that I find least satisfying regarding the problem of evil, is to respond that evil comes because humans have free will. Basically, it is a worse moral bad for God to abridge our free will than all of the moral evils that are caused by our free will. And so if God is trying to maximize moral good overall, he should allow us to have free will. So, the first problem with this, of course, is that not all of the evil or suffering in our world stems from humans. There's a ton of suffering in the animal kingdom. There's much suffering that is caused by natural disasters. And there's much suffering caused by genetic disorders and so on. So, the response with free will doesn't solve the problem that there are many bad things that still happen to us that God could simply stop if he actually cared about our suffering and therefore was omnibenevolent. Another response to this free will objection is to ask whether one has free will in heaven. Because if one has free will in heaven, and there is no sin or suffering in heaven, then it is possible to have no sin or suffering and free will at the same time. God merely chose not to make that the case on earth. Another objection to the free will objection is to point out that it is possible to give people free will, but also make them actually incapable of enacting that free will on negatively on others by harming them through either physical means, such as including a force field bubble around everyone that can only be crossed if it's mutually consensual, or having a cosmic and perfectly effective police force, such that people could still want to harm others, could still attempt to harm others, but would merely fail. Another objection to the free will argument is that free will is actually an incoherent concept if you have an omniscient God, and an omniscient and omnipotent, either one actually, but especially omniscient. Because if God is omniscient, then he knows exactly what we are going to do before we do it. And so we can't choose otherwise, because if we could, then of course he wouldn't be omniscient. And if we can't choose otherwise, then we have no choice but to do what he thinks we'll do. Furthermore, if this omniscient God is also omnipotent, not only do we lose free will, our actions all eventually stem from him, because he made us and set the starting process of the universe in motion, already knowing that the specific arrangement of entropy and particles that he began the universe with would lead to specific actions on the part of specific individuals. And so if you start a process in motion, knowing and therefore intending, if you start a process in motion that you have complete control over, knowing 100% in advance what will happen, then that is a process that you are responsible for doing. And so suddenly God becomes ultimately responsible for all of our actions. And so not only do we lose free will, but we lose any ontological separateness to our actions from God. Basically, if an omnipotent and omniscient God exists, it's impossible for us to be anything other than puppets. Another objection that can be made to the problem of evil is to say that God God's plan requires evil in some way. Um, Here's the thing about that. God is omnipotent. God can achieve whatever his goal is by any means he wants. That's the definition of omnipotence. God doesn't. The reason you have to enact a certain plan to get a certain result is because you're acting within certain constraints and manipulating or going around those constraints in the plan. If there are no constraints on you, you don't need to plan. You just get what you want, no matter what. So God should have no need, if he is omnipotent, of a mysterious plan. Because there are no limits to what God can do, and therefore he doesn't need to decide how to do something. He can just have it done. And of course, you could argue that what God wants done necessarily includes suffering, such that for God to achieve what he wants done without suffering would be a logical incoherency. And in this, we're assuming that you take the view of non-absolute omnipotence, where God can't violate the laws of logic, or won't, perhaps. Although this really works better as an objection if you think God can't. To which I would respond that what kind of omnibenevolent being has a goal that requires suffering in order to achieve it? Another objection that's sometimes made to the problem of evil is to object that the atheist is actually borrowing the standard for evil of Christianity in order to disprove Christianity. And on the first hand, that's actually not what I'm doing. I'm highlighting that there is a contradiction between suffering, which is not necessarily a moral thing if you want to be a complete moral nihilist about it, and omnibenevolence, which again is not a moral thing necessarily. It's just a statement that you don't want any being to suffer. Right? So there's no real necessary moral component to this. I'm just outlining that omnibenevolence is should necessarily desire to annihilate suffering in the beings that it cares about. I'm not borrowing a definition of suffering from Christianity, or a definition of omnibenevolence from Christianity. I'm just highlighting that there's an a priori analytic relation between these two concepts, and it doesn't require a moral dimension. Furthermore, even if I were borrowing from Christianity in order to disprove Christianity, that's how a reductio ad absurdum works. That's how a proof by contradiction works. You assume the premises of your interlocutor in order to demonstrate how they internally conflict and lead to a contradiction. So even if the atheist were assuming necessarily Christian premises in order to make the problem of evil work and demonstrate the contradiction in those premises, that's not invalid. In fact, that's quite valid. It's an entire form of argumentation that's valid in discrete mathematics and in philosophy, where you assume for the sake of argument the premises of your opponent and then show how they lead to a contradiction. So, I think that the problem of evil is actually a serious problem for Christianity. I think that the best possible way to deal with it as a Christian is simply to deny the omnibenevolence of God and to affirm that some vessels are made for wrath, and some are made for joy, and it's acceptable for God to cause suffering even in the vessels made for joy. And at that point, it becomes an entirely different discussion about whether that's a being that you should want to worship and exactly how biblical that doctrine is. Another possible response to the problem of evil is to say that you require suffering in order to enjoy happiness to the fullest. And so God is causing great suffering to everyone now, so that for those who go to heaven, it will be an even greater joy. But you see, this is a quirk of human psychology called the happiness treadmill, or the hedonic treadmill. This is not something that's necessarily true about the human psyche. Furthermore, the definition of heaven, in Christian theology at least, is a place where you are maximally happy all the time. So shouldn't it be able to break that rule about contrast? Additionally, how could a finite, say, 80 years of suffering provide, quote unquote, seasoning or salt to an infinite amount of time spent being happy? Additionally, is like if we are doing this sort of calculation, right? Like if starving your child for the first couple of years of their life makes them appreciate food all the more for the rest of their lives, is that something that's valid to do? Is that actually creating a greater amount of overall happiness? Because the overall amount of happiness that they have later on in their life, because they have food, because they appreciate it more, I don't think it will outweigh the huge amount of suffering that they'll have for starving for the first couple of years. Scale that up, and you have a problem, right? And now if you object to this by saying, well, it's infinite happiness in heaven, so of course it outweighs anything that happens here on earth. Well, then you run into another problem where, like, if you're talking about maximizing happiness overall, then it shouldn't matter at all what God does to us on earth, right? But like an omnibenevolent being doesn't want to cause any suffering for any amount of time, even if it's outweighed in the long run. Additionally, I want to point out that all of the theodicies for the problem of evil that I've talked about for the rest of the previous 17 minutes of this video, all work in reverse. Essentially, you can take a problem of good where you're trying to defend an omni-sadistic God, and you switch the words like suffering and happiness or good and evil in all of the previous theodicies, and they all work to defend an all-evil God who only allows good for unknown reasons. And so if a set of arguments can defend the opposite, as well as they can defend the thing that they're trying to defend, right? If an argument can defend the opposite of its conclusion just as well as its conclusion, then I don't think that that's a very worthwhile argument. So, I'll leave you with a final thought, which is, given the problem of evil, if you take it seriously, what does your theology start to look like? Okay, thank you for listening, and bye.